Right, back to some wargaming then, after those trains. This is, as you can see, Breaking the Chains, War in the South China Sea by Compass Games. Just pan out there for a kind of shot of the map. I really like this map, you know. I like the kind of muted colours, I like that kind of grey, green, bluey ocean colour that they chose. I think it looks really good. And the counters are beautiful as well, a bit like the Next War counters, big sort of 5-8 inch counters, really got a lovely feel to them, clip really nicely, quite light, just really nice to handle. Okay, I did a couple of films on this, didn't I, of a scenario with the Chinese steaming out of this kind of area on the coast and heading for the Spratlys, and some US and Vietnamese forces down there to try and stop them. That's all well and good, but this time I'm going to try and play the campaign game, which is the full 30 turns on this nifty turn track here. So, yeah, and the victory conditions are pretty simple. There are 24 victory point hexes on the map. Any hexes with a white border, so the Spratlys here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 victory hexes, and the Paracels there are 4, and so on. And the Chinese want 12 of them. If they get 12 at the end of the game, then they win. If they have 11 or fewer, then the opposition, called the First Island Coalition, that wins. So, yeah, the Chinese want 12 victory hexes. They start with 6 because they start with the Paracels. They start with 2 on the Chinese mainland here at Zhangjiang, and up there at Dinghai, if I can read that correctly. So that's 2 plus the Paracels, 6. And there are targets Hanoi there, next to Bangkok here, 8 down here in the Spratlys as we've seen. Then there's 5 up in Taiwan, 2 in Japan, and Guam over here in the Pacific. So that's those are all the victory hexes. As you can see, half the points are here in the South China Sea, 8 Spratlys hexes, 4 Paracels hexes. So tempting targets there, and obviously Taiwan's and Japan as another option for hoovering up victory hexes. Okay, so yeah, the other major thing that the campaign game is going to feature is all the neutral countries represented by all these different stacks of counters here, and they are going to join in the game on one side or the other. At the start of the game, the Chinese forces are obviously on the Chinese coalition side. The First Island Coalition is represented at the start of the game purely by Vietnam. So the Vietnamese forces are going to be facing off against the Chinese. And then, as the game progresses, neutrals, which include the US, will join one side or the other. And that's all explained here in this politics phase section, which I've been looking at to work out how this is going to work. So it's fairly clear here. There are 3 factions: Chinese, First Island China Coalition, and the neutrals. This Chinese always includes the People's Republic of China, and the First Island Coalition always includes Vietnam. All other nations, including the USA, begin the game as neutrals. So then it goes on to say that during the politics phase, which happens fairly early on in the game, politics phase is the second phase in the game after Black Ops and some land cruise missile strikes, special operations stuff. The players determine which neutrals might join either side, and there are some choices. The United States can elect to join the First Island Coalition on any game turn at the player's discretion. And if they do, Australia, Japan and Singapore also join them at the same time. So Singapore down here. So the moment the USA joins, Australia, Singapore and Japan also join. And Thailand can then join the First Island Coalition at least one turn later. If Thailand does join, then Burma, or Myanmar as I think it's called here, then joins a turn after that. Cambodia joins China a turn after that. Cambodia and Laos in here can join any turn, at least one turn after Thailand joins the other side. Taiwan will stay strictly neutral throughout unless it's invaded. It will never join the Chinese side, but if the Chinese don't invade it and the Americans or the First Island Coalition do invade it, it will fight on its own against whoever invades it. If China invades it, it'll join the First Island Coalition. If the First Island Coalition invade it, it will fight on its own against the invaders. Presumably controlled by the Chinese player, though not technically part of the Chinese contingent. Brunei will not do anything because it has no forces. India can join the First Island Coalition. And then Malaysia and the Philippines will join. There's a sort of die roll table where they may or may not join in, one on the First Island side, one on the Chinese side, based on a die roll. And you can keep track of who's joined what on this chart over here, which I've got set up there with these boxes that you can just slide counters in to show who's joined what and where and when. Cool. So that's how things are looking in terms of the sort of politics. I am now going to have to start working out who to set up where. I think the Chinese set up first, so we'll do that and we'll just take it from there. The setups are saying China sets up, then Taiwan, Vietnam, the USA has various setups because they get to start some stuff wherever they like, some stuff in certain boxes and certain areas, and then neutrals are going to set up, depending on which country's going to control them in the long run. So there are a number of different extra things in this game, but I'm sure we'll get to them as I go through setup. One of them is these transit boxes. You've got one there for Darwin in Australia, and one there for the Indian Ocean. And it can take quite a long time for stuff to transit out of these boxes onto the map. So if we just say, take a look here, stuff in the San Diego box is going to arrive in Guam. If it's an air unit, it only takes a day, but if it's a carrier, then it's going to take a week. If it's transports, over 2 weeks, and any other naval forces, 10 days. So American forces starting in this San Diego box or this Hawaii box are going to take a good long time before they get onto the map. And so you figure that there's going to be an initial sort of Chinese blast to try and take as much as they can, and then an American counterattack as they build, as the First Island Coalition build forces to stop them. Maybe some interesting decisions about when to trigger the Americans joining the First Island Coalition. But maybe not. Who knows? Given that, the Chinese, if they want to take Japan, they'll just run in and take them irrespective of whether they've joined or not. So you might as well have them active and able to make decisions rather than neutral and just sat in their own country. Anyway, that's how we're looking, and I'm going to set everything up and pause to talk about it as I do so, I guess. Okay, here with some breaking the chains then. By Compass Games, I was just thinking about setup. The Chinese setup first. Chinese coalition. And so I've got all their forces out. There's no rebuilds or anything in this game, so that's it. Once you've lost something, you've lost it. Because a day in this game, a turn in this game is a day, so the campaign is lasting 30 days. That's not enough time to rebuild squadrons of fighters and all the infantry divisions and stuff. Okay, so yeah, just going to touch on a few things to think about here. We're trying to take hexes with a white outline, Spratlys, hold the Paracels, maybe attack into Taiwan and Japan. That's where all the victory points are. To do that, to take a hex, you have to have ground forces in it. So inevitably what that means is if you want to take the Spratlys or you want to take Taiwan, you have to have transports to transport ground troops. So the first thing to think about, or the first thing to at least be aware of, is that these 5 transport units here, which is all the Chinese have, each one can take 2 steps of land units, and if they're all gone, the game's pretty much done, because apart from an air transport here, there would be no way of getting a land unit into a victory hex off the mainland, and the mainland has 1 there, 2 there, and 1 up there. So if you don't have naval transport, you can't win. So that's the first thing to understand. The next thing to understand is that here in the Black Ops phase of every turn, there's a land attack cruise missile strikes. That's one of the first things you do. Cruise missile strikes. These can be carried out by US destroyer groups and nuclear submarines, Chinese destroyer groups, nuclear submarines, and surface-to-surface missile battalions. And they can hit what's known as satellite illuminated targets. And that means, you know, in this game, that means targets that have been, you know, picked up and designated by satellite imaging. And that means, that means in this game, air units based on land, fortifications, of which the Chinese have none, naval units in port, and SAM and SSM units. So, air units on land, SSM units, SAM units, and naval units in port. So, right at the start of the game, when the Americans are going to have 2 nuclear submarines and 3 destroyer groups to set up anywhere, and these cruise missile strikes have a range of 15 hexes, pretty much everything is going to be vulnerable to cruise missile strikes. Pretty much everything. There's no way you can put something in the Chinese can set up where things aren't going to be vulnerable. So the next thing to think about is how they're going to set up their considerable air assets and their SAM sites and their missile sites, so as to minimise the potential impact of those cruise missile strikes. So that's got to be done. The next thing to think about is all this air power, with the exception of this one that's got an omega symbol. That means it's a 1-step unit. All these are 3-step ground-based air units. They're not carrier fighters because I've put the carrier fighters with the carriers. And these guys can only be based out of cities or ports. So, you know, Zhangjiang there, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Xiamen, Fuzhou, and so on. Obviously, if you're going to take Taiwan, then you know you can project a lot of air power over it, but you're then committing yourself to fighting an awful lot of defenders. Those 2 trays worth of counters there, that and that, is the Taiwan defences. So if you want to fight your way through that lot in 5 hexes, well, the Chinese are welcome to give it a go, and they do have resources. Let's be fair. So they could look at doing that, and that look at that as a use for all this air power, and have a crack at Taiwan. The other advantage of having a go at Taiwan in terms of victory points is that these hexes are actual land hexes, which means you can put as much ground-based force into them as you like. These hexes in the Paracels and the Spratlys only count as islet hexes, and you can only put 2 steps of infantry into them, or ground-based units. And you could also put 12 steps of air into each of these ports, whereas you can put none on islets, and you can put 1 step on here, or 1 step on here. So the advantages of looking at Taiwan are that you can defend it a lot more heavily, and obviously your air power, your initial air power position gives you a lot of coverage to attack it. If you want to get down here and take hexes of the Spratlys, you probably want to be trying to take Brunei, or get Malaysia on your side as the Chinese, and then base out of this place here, Kota Kinabalu, from which you could project air power over the whole of the Spratlys. So that looks like a nice option. But to get Malaysia on your side, you have to get naval units into the Vietnamese area of the Spratlys, and then have a nice dice roll. Or you could try and get air units into Puerto Princess here in Indonesia, the Philippines. But the Philippines are never going to join the Chinese side, so you'd have to fight them for it. So that's another option, is to try and get points from the Spratlys, in which case we want to be trying to base air out of this city here, and we want a way of capturing that. So those are the things to think about, that I'm thinking about in trying to set up the Chinese. So I'm going to try and work out how to protect my transports, how to protect my land-based air units, possibly with surface-to-air missiles, because they have these green defensive numbers. Obviously stacking those two together, because they're both targets, makes sense, because you may as well offer 1 target as 2. So there's no point not putting area defence with planes. Planes are already targets. This doesn't make them more of targets. Similarly, we probably want to stack our surface-to-surface missiles in the same places, so that these defensive SAM sites are offering as much of this area missile defence protection as we can. And then we want our transports out of port, so that they can't be targeted by cruise missile strikes, somewhere tucked away, as safe as we can get them, out of port, with a lot of defence around them, until we can work out what enemy cruise missile options are available around us. Obviously they want to be near a port that we might be trying to funnel ground troops into as well, so that's something else to think about. So that's my thoughts at the moment. That's enough rambling from me. This video is going to end up really long again, unless I just do a bit of setup and then upload it. Anyway, onwards. Well, I've got the Chinese on the board in some sort of fashion. It's quite hard, this, setting up a brand new game. I don't even know what the counter mix for what they're going to be up against looks like. You know, obviously I know from that first scenario the Americans have got some pretty tasty hardware, but we don't know what we're going to be facing off against with the Vietnamese. We know that Taiwan has got a lot of counters.
Japan's likely to have a reasonably strong armed force, but we've no real idea what we're going to be facing and how good it is. So this is quite hard. The other thing is that, as I mentioned before, there's going to be some fairly early potential for cruise missile strikes from the Americans. And so we have to set up pretty defensively until we get to see, what the overall picture is. So, all the big stacks here have got the green defensive ratings on them, both on land and at sea. Our big naval forces, I assure you that any big naval stacks have got area defence like this in them. And we can't be cruise missiles when we're at sea, and everything is at sea. All the naval forces are at sea. I've only put on at sea counter if there's a port there, so it could be confusing as to whether they're at sea or not. But they are all at sea, so they can't be cruise missile strike. And it's very unlikely that the Americans would set up close enough, because any attacks they tried to launch, say from aircraft carriers, would run into all the ground-based air that could be thrown up to intercept, and that would be suicidal. We assume, unless the Americans wanted to come around here and try and pick off something like this. But, we'll see. We'll see. So we've set up pretty defensively with the Chinese, and now I'm going to start with, I think we'll do Vietnam and see what they've got to play with. Breaking the Chains by Compass Games. And I'm doing American setup. You can see we've got the Chinese on the board. I've thrown the Vietnamese on the board, so they've amassed most of their ground forces and the little air support they have up around Hanoi to try and protect that for what it's worth. And their naval forces on the south edge of Vietnam around Ho Chi Minh City, which will probably try and make a break across to the Spratlys, because they do have a transport which they can try and get some more troops over here. And I may actually move another of these, if they've got some ground units I can spare, I may drop another one down here, but I doubt it. The Thai forces, that's simply a case of throwing everything on the map. I haven't tried to optimise in any real way. It's very hard to optimise without really knowing how the game might play out. And they've got all their ground forces on this expanded version of the map over here with the fortification markers on and air and stuff. They look pretty tough. So we're now doing the Americans. Americans are interesting. They have scattered forces, some in this Indian Ocean box that will take time once they're activated to get into Singapore. They have forces over in San Diego and Hawaii, again, which can then travel from those boxes into various ports. I think they both arrive in Guam. And then they've got two free setups on, or semi-free and free setups on some forces. So if we have a look over here, Indian Ocean box, Singapore, Air 1 takes a turn, carriers 3 turns, landing craft 5 turns, other naval 4 turns. So over here, that unit presumably is on some transports somewhere, and there better be a transport here. That's carrying some F-35s. Well, let's assume then that they can just traverse somehow. I mean, I am assuming... Oh no, it's an MEU. Sorry, it's a marine unit, and it's a one-step marine unit which is on this Nimitz class carrier. So they will take 3 days to get somewhere, and the destroyers will take 4 days to get somewhere, and they can show up here in Singapore. This lot likewise can all make its way slowly to Guam, but it's taking a day for air, 5 to 7 days for carriers, 11 to 15 days for transports, and 7 to 10 days for other naval forces to make that trip. And then we've got this group here. Now this group can set up in the Darwin box, in Guam and in Okinawa. So we've got a couple of surface-to-air missiles, probably one setting up in Okinawa, if not both. Maybe one setting up in Guam. We've got some ground units. Possibly we drop one into Guam just to make sure it's not mugged, although I can't see the Chinese trying to get all that way out into the Pacific to invade it. But let's assume that we need to protect it. We've got a nuclear cyber transport and 4 air. Now air can rebase 24 hexes in the air moves cycle, so then you have to do some counting. From Guam they can rebase up into Okinawa, down through the Philippines and so on, but they can't get as far as Singapore. If they started in this Darwin box, then they've got to fly out of there and they can end up in Singapore or Guam or Zamboanga, but that's currently neutral. So they've got some interesting choices here. And then they've got equally interesting choices with this group, and this group are setting up anywhere on the map that isn't a Chinese setup hex, essentially. So these guys, any non-Chinese littoral or ocean hexes on the map, can set up literally anywhere. So again, what do the US want to do? And my feeling is with these guys that although it's quite a powerful force, 3 nice destroyers, 2 hidden, these will be hidden, these 2 nuclear submarines, and a Nimitz-class carrier with its complement of F-35s and Marines. It's not enough to stand in the way of that lot, and we don't want to fight in small packets. We want to try and consolidate our forces. So although one of the natural things to do would be to shove it in the South China Sea and Sea and try and defend the Spratlys from what's going to be coming in that direction, I think we're far better off keeping these out of harm's way and hooking them up with another force. Maybe those, or maybe something out of Singapore. So that's how I'm thinking, and then these guys are similarly going to be distributed in a way that makes sense, I think, defensively. Now what I'd really like to do, I think it makes sense to give to put the air down with some surface-to-air missile coverage, because land-based air can obviously be hit by cruise missiles. And Okinawa looks like a good place for that. I haven't checked whether you can rebase from Okinawa all the way down from Singapore. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. No, it's out of range to do that. But Okinawa does look cool as a starting point, because it does at least offer some sort of air protection to Japan in case the Chinese want to come this way, and of course it can support an attack on Taiwan as well, while keeping the forces mainly out of harm's way. So yeah, I think I'm talking myself into this. I'm going to set the Americans up in a little bit of a defensive stance, but with air and SAM sites in Okinawa. Setup's done here in Breaking the Chains. There are units all over the place. Yeah, Thai forces in there. Sometimes the colours are a little tricky to distinguish. In good light you can see that that's a kind of green colour, and these are a kind of black, and these are a kind of brown, but you know, if it's night and I've just got my lamps on, that's going to be a bit tricky, but anyway, we'll survive. Units over here in the Philippines, brown, these brown, goldy, brown, buff tan colour. Things down here in Malaysia, Australian Navy down there with some American forces, Singapore Navy here. I've had to start using these task force boxes because Singapore gets absolutely rammed. I mean, all this stuff in here is just the ground forces. They've got a lot of units, you know. So they've got three mechanized, some Marines, some helicopters, and some F5s. A pretty tough bunch of hombres down in there, and then they've got a big navy arriving, and then you start seeing that an American Nimitz class carrier with its aircraft and Marines and 3 Burke destroyers are going to show up there, plus the Indian Navy. They've got a CV as well with some decent fighters and guided missile frigate, guided missile destroyer or 2 with area defence. So they're not terrible. And then the Australians can turn up there if they want to out of this box with some infantry, transports, just some patrol craft and guided missile destroyer with area defence. Great. And then you've got the Singapore's own navy, transports, sub, don't know what that is, motorboats, guided missile frigate, and then these 2 American Patriot guys out there as well. Not quite sure what these represent, but what's that? What's an LCS? Not sure. The book would tell me, but anyway, it's a small sort of. You can see it's a coastal ship with the brown bar rather than a deep water ship with the blue bar. So there's a lot of stuff that could rock up in Singapore. And when you start getting all these neutrals and everything on the board, and you see how much that the Allies or the FICC, the Free Island First Island Coalition, could put in Singapore and then head up towards the Spratlys, that's quite an interesting prospect. The Thai forces, when you get them on the board, are not shabby at all, not too dusty. They have got they've got an air force worth talking about. You know, they've got some F-16s, some Alphas, some helicopters. They've got nothing to protect them from cruise missile strikes, but they have got, and then they've got another big air force here based out of Burma with some F5. I mean, these are good quality planes that they've got here, F-16s and F5s and stuff. American fighters with, if I flip them over to see their ratings, all with air-to-air ratings of 4. Let's have a look at these guys. These have got, air-to-air of 4, and air-to-surface of 3, anti-sub of 2, air-to-ground of 2. These are not shabby planes at all. They're as good as the stuff that China's putting in the air, that's for sure. Not quite as good as the top tier of American tech, but you know. So there's 5 or 6. There's a good air force in Thailand, some strong ground troops. They've got an aircraft carrier that's going to sail this way, I guess, round towards Singapore to hook up with fleets. A huge sort of alliance fleet. They've got a transport that they can mess around with. So, you know, they're not to be taken too lightly. So when you look at it, and when you first put the Chinese on the board, you think, oh, they've got masses and masses of stuff. But when you start putting down all the minor countries, or supposedly minor countries, and add up the weight of what they can throw into the field, it starts looking a lot more impressive and bolstered by some very, very high-tech, tough American stuff. This looks like it's going to be, really quite hard for both sides. So, yeah, it's hard to envisage how it's going to play out when it's difficult to know exactly how effective things are going to be. I've no idea how ground combat works, never done ground combat in this game, you know. But yeah, it's got me really excited to play it. It looks great. It really does. I can't really capture it on camera, but it really does look great when it's all set up. The counters are beautiful. It feels good. All the play aids are very useful. I've got this chart over here with some blank counters that I punched off the counter sheet just to mark when people join the different coalitions. So you just slide the counter down to show that Burma's joined the Chinese or whatever. So it shows you where they are.
got a map key down here and all the stuff we need, so I'm ready to go.